And only 100 years or so ago did humans start releasing rock phosphate, and really, give or take a bit, and releasing it around the Earth system. It's I've talked to you about the complexities of its movement through soil, and so on, and I now want to go on to consider transfers of phosphorus to waters and the accelerating phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus transfers to waters. Now this is actually where the heart of my research interest has laid over the years, and it's this sort of fascinating space where 100 years ago people started applying phosphorus to the soil and thinking it was a miracle, and it was, and it has been a miracle in feeding us all. But then this additional inevitable issue started to rise itself, in that people started to realise that it was actually leaking or moving out of the agricultural soils and out into the lakes, rivers and oceans, and actually quite a complex issue. In fact, I've spent most of my career, and probably will spend the remainder of my career, still studying all the nuances of that, which are really quite fascinating. But that slide's actually a really great picture of my colleague and student at the time, Neil Preedy, took of phosphorus leaving the soil. And this picture, this is a fantastic picture, one which my colleague Jim calls the most powerful image in the history of limnology. And very, very simply, it was a lake in northwestern Ontario in Canada, and this experiment happened in the 60s, 70s, early 70s, I believe it was, and it was called Lake Number 226, which was a series of experimental lakes that was being led that time. And as you can see in the figure caption there, the top part of the lake received inputs of nitrogen and organic carbon, equivalent to what might be received from domestic sewage inputs. The bottom half of the lake received similar amounts of carbon and nitrogen, but also phosphorus. And that shows you in an eye what phosphorus can do. And that basically is algal scum, it's chlorophyll rich, it's anoxic, it's got low oxygen, it's wrecked water quality, it's eutrophic, and it has no biodiversity, and we just do not want that. And unless we get on top of things, all this phosphorus which we produce, in agriculture and food production, if we don't get on top of the leakage to waters, that's the kind of thing which we are seeing happening in the lakes and rivers and possibly the oceans around the world. I'll come back to the oceans later. So if you like, that's the end point, that's the thing which we're concerned about, and this is what we are trying to do to understand it. A few years ago now, myself and a few colleagues, we came up with this concept called the phosphorus transfer continuum, which is a really simple but I hope useful conceptual model to help describe that linkage from land to water and how phosphorus transports itself from land to water. So it basically goes from, as you can see, sources, mobilisation, delivery or transport to impact. And very simply, again we'll go into this in more detail in other courses, but very simply the sources are the inputs, which I've kind of talked about. Mostly it's fertiliser. We also have inputs to farms which come from animal feed as well, if animals have phosphorus in their feed, which they sometimes do. Then we have this idea of the next component of the continuum is mobilisation. Mobilisation is where things start to leave the soil, there's three types of mobilisation. There's mobilisation by solubilisation, that's the kind of chemical process. It leaves soil by solubilisation or leaching, perhaps you might want to call it. The second one is mobilisation by physical detachment. That means that particles just physically leave the soil because they're washed away, perhaps at the same time as being eroded, soil erosion or colloid movement or something. And the third type is what we call incidental losses, and that's where basically a farmer or a land manager would put phosphorus onto the land in fertiliser or manure, say, and that phosphorus doesn't even get a chance to become incorporated into the soil, it just gets washed off, and that's called an incidental mobilisation. So 3 types of mobilisation: solubilisation, physical detachment and incidental losses, and they're all really different. I mean, you know, just common sense says they're really different processes. But it's amazing how, having researched this area for, I guess, for 25 years now, how when we started out, we used to get them all mixed up and confused. And it is confusing because we've got physical processes on the one hand, and we've got chemical and biological processes on the other, and this incidental thing going on in the middle. So it's all an anthropogenic bit, if you like. So source, mobilisation. The next bit is delivery or transport, and this is the kind of hydrological connection down the slope that takes it from the river to the from the soil slope into the river. And then finally we have an impact, which is an economic or a sociological, a biological or an ecological impact, maybe many miles from source and maybe many years later. And that's what makes it really complex. And that's the transfer continuum. It's complex. It goes source, mobilisation, delivery and impact. Okay. So just give you some examples now of some of the research that's been going on by myself and my colleagues and peers that might be of interest. There has been a really big study which ran from 2010 to 2020 approximately, called the Demonstration Test Catchments in England, and I was part of a team which worked up here in the Eden River catchment in the north west of England, and other teams worked in the Wensum and the Hampshire Avon in the Tamar in the south of England. And this was my team in the north west in the Eden, and we had about, most time we had 30 people working together, stakeholders, farmers, land managers, water industry people, all integrating and working around that space, trying to understand nutrients and phosphorus and water quality from studying this river. I'm going to come back to the Eden and the demonstration work, but also wanted to just highlight this other paper which we published not too long ago. Steve Powers led the paper, a really nice study where we compared 3 world rivers. River Thames in blue, in red, that's the long-term time record here from the 1940s up to present day. And what we showed is that the River Thames, over years, we managed to clean up the phosphorus emissions to the River Thames through mostly sewage cleanup, actually, not necessarily cleaning up the agriculture. And then similarly the Maumee River, which is in the Great Lakes in the northern US, that's been cleaned up since the 1970s because of cleaning up agricultural practices. And then this black one is the Yangtze River Basin in China, which, according to our calculations at the time, was actually increasing in the net annual phosphorus input. The point of that study was that it's a long-term thing, okay? And governments and policymakers find this frustrating and difficult to grasp, that when you're dealing with things like the phosphorus cycle or any nutrient cycle, but it's this link between land and water, okay? We are talking decades really of connectivity as things move from A to B down and through the system. And that makes for this issue that some people call legacy or legacy phosphorus. So the phosphorus that we see in the rivers today is a legacy of what's happened before. It's not necessarily what's going on now, although it might be manifesting itself now, if that sort of makes sense. So that's the first 3 components. So I'm now coming to the last bit, which is when we talk about an accelerating phosphorus cycle, ? And I want to bring in a sort of extra twist to everything that's going on, and to really heighten the drama perhaps of the story, to give it a bit more of a immediacy, or a bit more of something a bit more compelling to it. But this was quite a dramatic slide taken in December 2015 during Storm Desmond, when myself and here in this image my dog, my daughter